He told us that he was God, that he controlled us, that we were basically worthless, and we were never going to get anywhere. Especially the fact that we were women.
Straight A's on the pad, just something great. Straight lace states the quarterback won't let him taste. Straight chase in the glass while the girls get shit-faced. Straight race to hide from class, as she sat since 5th grade. Beautiful, big-breasted, mature young thing. Type to ruin you, so ignore that love thing. Free spirit, dancing to music, only she hearing. We all want to be near it, for what she ain't revealing. She's confident and calm, that's how we all read it. That heart is not for sharing, it's mom, for a reason, and it's in pieces. I'm grieving, life's not how you perceive it. She fears nobody believe it if she keeps it a secret. The key to all of her deepest and darkest feelings came from a happy family in a house with high ceilings. And everything was okay until she was 8, the day your parents ran late. Jada was raped.
And when I walked in,
All right, so that was just a portion of a song that I put out in 2014 called "Rape." I think that that verse is particularly poignant because it tells this story of an upper class or upper middle class white girl who is the star cheerleader, straight A student, and gets raped. This is the fear that all parents have. And honestly, it's to a great extent caused by a lot of misinformation. For one thing, stranger danger is a myth. 90%,
unknown caller.
that's really convenient. 90% of sex assault victims know the attacker. So that's the first thing. 95% of sexual offenses are committed by someone not on the registry. And only 3.5% of registrants are convicted of another sexual offense within 3 years, compared to the average recidivism rate of 67%. Yet, as an abolitionist, the most common question I get is, what about the rapists? What about the pedophiles? Today, I have a really special guest on the show. His name is Michael McKay. He works with NARSOL, the National Association for Rational Sex Offense Laws. He's also a formerly incarcerated person who is on the registry. So he has a lot of experience, not just research like myself, from which to pull in presenting this conversation, this side of the conversation that is almost never heard and that people really do need to understand. So Michael, thank you so much for joining me. I apologize about the phone call. I'm now on airplane mode, so we should be good to go.
No problem. Glad to be here.
Great. So tell me, if I just asked you, what is the biggest misconception about people on the registry or about what the registry does, what would you say?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about the registry is that everyone on it somehow fits a single category of person. They all are rapists or child molesters. They all are violent, or they're all just awful people. And honestly, it's a reasonable but emotional assumption that people make because they don't really have any information. It's easy to make assumptions about things that you know very little about. And if you don't know somebody who is on the registry or has been incarcerated, it's really easy to believe that they all fit a specific mold. Before I went to prison, I believed everyone in prison was the same. And I was one of those tough on crime people who believed that everyone there deserved to be there, and everyone there had abdicated all of their rights as a citizen by breaking the social contract with America, blah, blah, blah. I can remember in my mid-20s thinking that we should just take everyone in the prisons and send them all to some island out in the middle of the Pacific, and we could call it Cannibal Island. And and I thought it was funny because I didn't know anybody who'd ever been to prison. So it's easy to dehumanize them or devalue them as human beings because to you they're not real. And
Right.
then you go to prison and then you realize that, you know what, those people aren't much different than myself. And suddenly your eyes are opened. I know my eyes were certainly opened through the whole incarceration and registration process. So I think the biggest misconception that people have is that those people are not like me. And
Yeah.
that's wrong.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and that absolutely applies to all people who are incarcerated for the most part, and not just people who may have been incarcerated for what might be considered a sex-related crime. That it applies to everyone. What would you say were the biggest? Were there any extreme circumstances while you were incarcerated that kind of pushed you in that direction, stronger than anything else? Is there anything you can recall specifically? And in addition, overall, what were your biggest learnings while you were there, and why do you think it took being incarcerated to gain this understanding?
Gosh, you sure do. You ask those questions that just have any one of those. I could come up with 3 or 4 hours of talking points on
Well,
that,
I
but
do that on purpose because
obviously, yeah.
yeah, my goal with these is to give you a platform. So
Sure.
you take that in any direction you want.
Well, I think the first thing that really struck me was the abusive nature of the whole system. It it's very dehumanizing at every step of the way, and most of the time for no real reason other than because they can. And so you're treated and herded like cattle. You're warehoused like packages. You are not even referred to as people or by name. The one and once you spend any time there, you realize just how many of the people there have mental illness issues, are victims of circumstance, people who have just really horrible coping skills, have addictions. And of course, they do what human beings do in prison, in any situation. They gravitate to people who are like them, who share the same values. And so they form cliques and gangs and whatever you have. So, but it's not anything that anybody wouldn't do under similar circumstances. You look for safety in numbers. We are herd and social animals. And so it's really easy to sit on the outside and look in and say, yeah, those people are acting like animals, or those people don't deserve any rights, or they should just be lined up against the wall and shot. But, spend a few days there yourself, and suddenly you realize that those people are us, just put in very inhumane surroundings and reacting the way any human being would react. Something that you reminded me also is you asked me about misconceptions. One of the biggest misconceptions about people on the registry is that they all committed a some sort of a contact crime against another human being, that they raped someone, they molested someone, when in fact those categories of crime are an incredibly small percentage of the people on the registry. The vast majority of people on the registry are there for looking at pictures. Now think about that for a minute. I'm not going to say everyone has seen porn, but a lot of people, most people have seen porn. How many people have been able to verify the age of the person appearing in that pornography? The person might look like they're 30 years old, but one of the biggest porn stars of the 90s turned out to be 15 years old. Tracy Lords, if you remember that. She was very, very famous. She went on to have a Hollywood career too. So she was able to, I won't say gracefully, but she was able to recover from that. But she was on every porn site, every adult bookstore, video rental place. She was everywhere, but she was 15 years old the whole time, and nobody knew it. So, and that's the vast majority of people on the registry, people who have looked at, downloaded, or shared illegal images. But just think for a moment how difficult it is for you to know. And obviously, there's a category of people who, if you're looking at toddlers or something, it's pretty obvious that person isn't 18. But the bottom line is, there's for the most part, it's a very difficult thing for someone really to know what they're looking at, or even if they looked at it purposefully. I mean, how many pop-ups do we see come up on our web searches and our just meandering around the internet? How do you know that you haven't looked at illegal porn? It's not like there's a big banner that appears above it that says this picture is illegal. And there's just so many kids, teenagers, who are just exploring, who end up having a SWAT team show up at their house in the middle of the night and having their whole family out, handcuffed on the lawn because they looked at illegal images on the internet. It's crazy.
Wow. All right. So much to unpack there. And so important for people to understand. My first comment is twofold. One, you have to assume that the population of people who are interested in younger looking people is way bigger than the percentage of people who are surprised by a SWAT team and end up incarcerated. And I say that because if you go to any porn site, and yes, I'm not embarrassed, I've been there. If you go to any of them, you will see entire sections of those sites dedicated to women, or I guess men, depending on where you're going, or whatever, individuals who look younger. It's, watch these videos if you're interested in people who look younger than 18. Okay. Right. So that's the first thing. Ask yourself if you've ever watched one of those videos, intentionally or otherwise. The other part of it is only certain people, I presume, are publicly, paraded around so that everyone knows they're a pedophile.
Let me jump in real quick.
Yeah,
there.
tell me if
First
that's
of all,
not true.
There's a lot to unpack there as well. First of all, the term pedophile is thrown around inaccurately by a lot of people. The term is, first of all, pedophilia is a medical diagnosis. It's not a slur or just what you call somebody you don't like or someone with whom you disagree politically. Certainly. So just because you don't like the senator in your state, you don't call him a pedophile. Back in the day when I was a teenager in my 20s, or you called everybody a communist if you didn't like them, right? And now you call anyone you don't like a pedophile. But the medical diagnosis and the actual definition of pedophile or pedophilia is an attraction to prepubescent children. All right, so somebody who, a 19-year-old who dates a 16-year-old is not a pedophile. But the law and society wants to categorize them that way because there's this arbitrary line at the 18th birthday. So how many of us, when we were 18, did not date somebody under 18? I would guess that that's a very normal thing, but we have somehow taken that and legally codified it as a crime. It's literally a crime. And there are, I'm not going to say thousands, there are tens of thousands of children on the sex offense registry who were convicted at 18 for having sex with somebody who was 17. And this is a favorite thing for parents to threaten somebody with, is that if you don't stop seeing my daughter or my son, blah, 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 I'm going to call the police because you're committing a crime. So that's the first thing I wanted to throw out there. The other thing was that they've done a study, and the two most searched terms on these pornography sites is teen and young. So they're not just a popular category, they are the most popular category of pornography on the legal websites. So all of the legal porn sites have made their money by emulating this entirely biological urge that human beings have, which is to be attracted to women who are just past childbearing age. And as much as we like to, turn away from that, we are biologically hardwired, just like every animal, to be attracted to the opposite sex just as they come out of that puberty process. So there's definitely a biological imperative on the part of us as a species to have those kinds of attractions. Now, that doesn't say we can't be civilized and say, you got to draw the line someplace and let's draw the line at 18, blah, blah, blah. That's great. Excuse me. But if you're going to draw a line like that, you've got to be consistent, not arbitrary, and you've got to be kind of even-handed in how you apply those kinds of laws. And that's one of the reasons why we have that in the name of the organization, Association for Rational Sexual Offense Laws. So, for example, there's this arbitrary line in the age, and then there's this arbitrary line on the ground that says if I'm standing on this side of the Texas state line, it's a crime. But if I take 2 steps to my right, it's not a crime for an 18-year-old to have sex with a 17-year-old. You see what I'm saying? So you've got these arbitrary lines everywhere. And not only that, but the crime. Most people don't know this, and this is another misconception that I like to talk about, is that everyone knows what statutory rape is, but they don't realize that it's a defense. It's a defense against the charge of having sex with somebody under the age of 18. But it's only a defense against that crime specifically. So let's say, for example, you have a 19-year-old who has sex with a 16-year-old, right? But the age of consent in that state is 16. So you can't charge him with rape. But did she see him naked? Well, then we can charge him with exposing himself to a minor because the statutory rape defense doesn't apply. Did he talk about sex with her? Well, then we can charge him with communicating obscene messages and materials to a minor. Did he take her across the state line for a picnic? Well, now you can charge him with transporting a minor across state. So, yeah, you can't charge him with statutory rape, but I can think of 8 crimes you can charge him with, and every one of those would put him in prison for 20 years.
Wow. All right. I was 18. I had just recently left for college, and my girlfriend was still in high school. If I were unlucky, that would be me. I wouldn't be here necessarily today at all. Who knows?
Right.
Because for anyone who doesn't know, a single interaction with police increases the likelihood of future criminality. A single interaction with the system could mean loss of job, loss of home, loss of children, just without even ever making it to trial. Just being in jail and being too poor to pay your bail could lead to all of those things in minutes, in days. And of course, it's really important to note not only are less than 5% of the 5 million people in U.S. prisons, jails, parole, probation, not only are only 5% sex offenders, but just like every other thing that I talk about related to the prison industrial complex, sex offender registration across the country disproportionately affects Black men. So again, we're talking about something that we may have all thought about at one point or another. Some of us may have been guilty of it without even knowing. And only certain people are being targeted and incarcerated. So again, if you are wealthy and white, you're probably more likely for no one to ever know what you've done.
Right. I call it the 3 W's: wealthy, white, and well-connected.
Exactly.
Those are the people for whom these laws really don't apply. It's just like, and really, unfortunately, when you start looking at what I call the injudicial system, injustice system, you realize that we have 2 completely different systems. We have one system for the wealthy, white, and well-connected, and you have another system for everybody else. And it becomes most apparent, and it's starting to become more apparent in terms of just general interactions with law enforcement, as we've all seen from the Black Lives Matter movement and the Floyd incident and things like that since then. But the moment you personally become justice impacted, you start noticing these things. You go to jail and you look around, and there are no wealthy people in that jail with you. They're all poor, unhoused, minority people in jail with you. You know, my first night in jail, I spent in a jail that had, two bunk beds. So it was built for 4 people, but there are 6 people in the jail. The whole thing is 8 feet by 8 feet. The bunks touch the toilet on both sides. One of them has explosive diarrhea. The other one is going through drug withdrawals. 2 people are sleeping on a concrete floor. And that was my first experience in a county jail.
Caged
And
like animals.
yeah,
And even
and then
animals
you go to
don't deserve
prison. Yeah, and you go to prison and you realize, wait a minute, the so-called minorities are the majority here.
Right.
Um, and then you look at the offender registry, and 90 something percent of the people on the registry are, practically living in cardboard boxes or tents or hovels, pigsties. They can't get a job. They can't, no one will rent to them. And so this cycle perpetuates itself because you look at that guy and you think, I would slide away from that guy on the bus stop bench. But we don't think about the fact that we created that guy. We wouldn't give him a job. We wouldn't give him a place to live. We told him he couldn't go home to his family. Um, there are places I spoke with some folks from Chicago a few months ago, the Chicago 400. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but
No.
they are people on the registry who are unhoused. And because they're unhoused, they have to report to the police department every week to register.
Wow.
All right. Now they start showing up at 5 o'clock in the morning and sometimes aren't seen until 5 o'clock that afternoon. They line up in front of the police department and the line goes all the way down the block and they spend all day, literally all day, doing nothing but waiting to tell the police officer, I don't have a fixed address. But I do sleep over in that park over there, or I sleep on this bench at this street corner. And that's it. Now, you tell me how somebody can get a job, any kind of a job. I don't care if you're working, sweeping floors at McDonald's. How do you keep that job if you have to spend one full day every week at the police department? You don't.
Correct.
So we force this situation onto someone, and then we point fingers at them and go, haha, you really should just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and change and be a better person and blah blah blah. And it's disgusting and it's disheartening. And one of the reasons I do this kind of advocacy work is I realized once I got out of prison, and I've only been out of prison for 2 years.
Okay.
I realized that once I got out of prison and finished up my probation, which was only 1 year, thank God. And boy, that's a whole nother topic right there.
Yeah.
But I am still on the registry, and I do have to go register every 90 days, which is kind of a pain, but they're nice to me, and I'm in and out pretty quickly usually, and I'm probably their least worrisome client, if you want to call it that. But the bottom line is, I realize that I'm doing better than 99% of the people out there who have been hit with the same kinds of barriers thrown up to them. I'm just lucky that I made some good decisions before I went to prison, before I got put on the registry. And so I don't have to worry about finding a place to live or where I'm going to sleep tonight or finding and or keeping a job. Imagine finding a job where, finding a potential employer who says, you know what, I know what you've done, but I'm still want to give you a chance. And so he hires you and you work and you do a good job and you've been there for a year, 2 years, maybe 10 years, who knows. And then suddenly a nosy neighbor finds out where you work, or a customer recognizes your face from the internet and complains loudly and starts marching up and down the street with signs in front of the business saying a sex offender works here. And guess what happens next? No business owner with a lick of sense is going to sacrifice his life savings and his business to be nice to you.
No.
So, yeah,
All right.
it's a
So
terrible situation.
it absolutely is. And, one thing that I thought of when you were talking about that line of people, not only is it incredibly difficult to get there every week, to possibly give up eating that day, if you happen to have a job, risk losing your job, it's also meant to embarrass them without a
Right.
doubt. If you have them standing on a line every week at the same time down the street, everyone knows who they are. It's parading them to embarrass them.
Right.
And just for what it's worth, like, there's a double stigma for people who are on the registry, because it's I don't want to say virtually impossible. It is incredibly difficult for a formerly incarcerated person or a houseless person to get a job or get an apartment. And that's without also being on the registry.
Right.
One other thing I wanted to say, because it hasn't been mentioned yet, although you hinted at it, is that the vast majority of perpetrators of crimes, whether it's sex related or not, has been a victim themselves. And we certainly know that to be true about sex related crimes. That's one of the main, if any kind of predictors exist, that's it. So again, we have, or, society has made, in a lot of cases, these people, and then society punishes them for the fact that there are no preventative measures in place, or protections that would actually do the right things, or addressing the underlying issues like poverty, people living 20 to a house, for example. Like, that's going to increase the likelihood that something bad would happen.
Sure.
So I have a couple more questions for you, if you don't
Just
mind.
one more follow up on that.
Sure. Yeah,
The
yeah,
vast
absolutely.
majority of sex crimes, particularly contact sex crimes, are crimes of opportunity. They are not crimes that were premeditated, and of course there are always going to be outliers, right? But looking at the statistics, the vast majority are crimes of opportunity that have nothing to do with pedophilia, nothing to do with an attraction one way or the other, wasn't planned out in advance, was not part of a, a pattern of crimes. It generally is something that just, probably a bad phrase to use, but falls into somebody's lap and they just make a really stupid decision on the spur of the moment without giving any thought to the ramifications, both to them, to their victim, their families. Nothing. It was just, it's as if you were a grown man and suddenly the pole dancer at the strip club fell into your lap, and you're suddenly, faced with the decision, what do I do now? And um, and if we treat this type of crime as something that's always a part of a pattern, always the result of some underlying paraphilia like pedophilia or something, um, then we're looking at it completely the wrong way. And unfortunately, as a society, we have a hard time looking at it any other way because, I mean, face it, America is the product of a Puritan ethic from day one. And nowhere else in the world is there this kind of prudishness and link between sex and sin, sex and the devil or whatever. We want here in America, we want to assume that pretty much anything having to do with sex is evil in some way, even if it's part of our own natures. We are all sexual beings, but we don't like to admit that. We don't want to say that when we have sex, it's wholesome and good, but when anyone else has sex, it's evil and dirty. So
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's just kind of an underlying assumption with everything that we do. And God forbid that we should try to prevent these crimes And I hesitate to even call them crimes. These kinds of things from happening, because sometimes they're not crimes. When you have two kids who are 8 years old playing doctor, I'm sorry, that's not a crime. And yet there are 8-year-olds who've been put on the sex offense registry for playing doctor with their siblings. All right. I did a story last year about a 14-year-old boy who was marched into was touched his little sister. His sister was 7 or 8 years old. 14-year-old boy touched his little sister sexually, told his parents, and his father marched him out into the front yard and shot him in the back of the head. Yeah, so that kid never even had a chance to get on the registry. This is the kind of society we live in,
Wow.
where we believe that any sexual activity between anyone is somehow diabolical, you know? And if we live in a society where a father can do that to his own son
Right.
for something that most kids have done. I know I did when I was a kid. There was exploration and show me yours and I'll show you mine kind of thing when I was 7, 8 years
A
old. I
big
think
part of
everybody
how
went through that.
kids, right. It's a big part
Yeah.
of how kids learn.
But but we abdicate. We're living in a society where we abdicate our rights as parents and we expect the state to raise our kids, and the state should punish them if they do something wrong. And then you overlay all of that with these harmful stereotypes and these assumptions about good and evil and sex is bad, and then you have a society that over sexualizes kids to begin with, you
Mm,
know. Um,
great point.
it's just a recipe for disaster, and there's no way we're going to fix this overnight. All we can hope for, at least, NARSOL is all about legislation and court cases that enforce an idea that the law should at least be rational. Nobody's saying that we should make rape legal. We don't want to legalize, you know, uh, we don't want to legalize any sex crimes, all right, but we want it to be rational in some way. We want to, and oh, by the way, if we can prevent them, then we don't have this prison industrial complex just destroying the lives of millions and millions of people without a single thought. I mean, it chews them up and sometimes never even bothers to spit them out, and it's always the same people. It's never the elites, it's the rest of us. And it would be nice if the same laws that applied in this state kind of applied in that state. That if the registry works this way here, then it should work the same way over there. But bottom line is it should be abolished, because we oppose all registries, not just sex offense registries. I don't know if you know this, but a lot of states are now pushing for domestic violence registries. Think about that for a minute. What married couple at some point in their marriage haven't got into a knockdown, drag out, screaming, hissy fit at each other? All right, maybe not everybody, but it's a very common thing. And all it takes, it doesn't even ever have to become physical. All it takes is somebody to say it did, and you are now on a domestic violence registry. A lot of states combine their sex offense registry with drugs and violent crimes. So you can have a drug offense and end up on that state's sex offense registry because it's all the same thing. And as we keep adding more and more registries, well, it's just, it takes us back. We haven't changed much in 1,000 years. We still, in our heart of hearts, believe that the way to deal with deviant people, and I don't mean sexually deviant, any way that they're deviant, people who belong to a different religion, people who are a different color from you, any deviancy from the norm is targeted for humiliation, for shaming, for blacklisting. Can't get a job, can't find a place to live, so you other them and you push them away someplace else. You just hope that they go somewhere else so you don't have to deal with them or look at them, right?
Yeah.
And
And
it's a shame, but we haven't changed that much psychologically.
no, sounds a lot like the Scarlet Letter.
Mhm.
And um, in the meantime, they're not just othering people, they're disappearing them and profiting off of them at the same time.
Yes.
And for anyone who is like gung-ho, for the system that exists and for police officers going after people involved in a domestic violence incident or a sex-related crime, it's important to note that a few things. One, it's legal in 35 states for cops to rape people in their custody. And believe me, they do. There are many stories about this. There are more than 250,000 untested rape kits in police custody today because they don't actually care. And there are many, many, many victims of domestic violence who are incarcerated today for finally standing up to their accuser, or excuse me, to their abuser. So if we're arresting the victims, then maybe we still do not actually care. So I think, Michael's exactly right. This is about Puritanism and othering people.
I don't know if you're familiar with this, but just a few days ago, a woman who had long ago filed a rape complaint and had a rape kit performed on her. I don't know, I think the crime was a couple of years ago. Nothing was ever done about her rape. Her attacker was never apprehended, never came up with a suspect. In fact, they never even really processed her rape kit afterwards. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons they never do that is because 95% of all criminal cases are plea bargained. They never go to court. So they don't really need the evidence to put people in prison. And so they don't process the evidence.
Wow.
Okay, that's really why those rape kits don't get processed. But here it is, like 2 years later, and they finally did process the rape kit and used her DNA to charge her with a crime. So, and this was just like 2 days ago in the news. You might look it up. It's a very interesting
incredible
case. But you make a really good point here. We have to totally, and this is not an official position of NARSOL, it's kind of my personal opinion here, but we have to totally look at law enforcement and what we really want it to accomplish in this country. Because, prior to the Civil War, law enforcement was a very communal thing, It was only after the Civil War and, those uppity slaves got their freedom that we suddenly decided we needed a much more militaristic way to keep those black people in their place, supposedly. And so our current law enforcement system is an outgrowth of the slave patrols who spent all of their time just putting those people back in their place, whether they were, quote, free or not. And there's a reason why modern policing is not much different than that era's Ku Klux Klan.
Yep.
There's a good reason for it. It's because they both stem from the same exact reason for being, and they've only become more militaristic and more underground since. But think about this for a minute. You keep reading about these cases where a mother calls the police because her son is having some sort of a mental issue in Walmart, and the police show up and shoot him because they're not trained to do anything else. They're not social workers. They're not parents, and we have to stop believing that some guy who has 3 weeks of training with a AR-15 is going to solve your family problems in the middle of Walmart.
Right.
It's just not the way it's designed to work.
Right. And as my listeners know, I'm an abolitionist. I don't believe it is possible to reform away the built-in white supremacy and violence of policing. I don't believe carceral punishment is the solution to anything either. Which brings me to kind of like my last area of focus with you. If you feel like there's more to say about what NARSOL is doing on a day-to-day basis, like where your focus is as an organization, sure. I'd love to know that. And I would also, love to talk as much as as much as you can about the disease or diagnosis aspect of this, because I'm an addict, and that is a disease. However, there's a lot of you know social external factors that play a big role in that as well. And I do, and I feel very confident because I am no longer actively using, that there are non-carceral treatments for addiction. One of the things that I hear all the time, and I truthfully don't know the answer, is if pedophilia or anything related to this sexual deviance, if that is some form of psychological issue,
Yeah.
can it be treated, and what should be done with people who we know have committed these acts, if we're not trying to be carceral, if we're not trying to punish and disappear people?
Well, from let's start with mental health issues first, and then we'll go a little bit more into what NARSOL is trying to
Perfect.
do
Perfect.
nationally, and that would probably be a good segue.
Yep.
It would be wrong to say that we don't know that much about paraphilias, which are sexual attractions to things that are not normally considered to be sexual. So somebody who has a foot fetish is
Mm-hmm.
sexually turned on by feet when most people aren't. And there are hundreds of paraphilias, sexual paraphilias, including chronophilias, which is an attraction to certain ages. There are people who are attracted to younger people, and gerontophilia, they're attracted to old people. We don't hear about that as much, but it happens. And people in the mental health field have done a lot of work on this. It's just like any obsession with anything. And in a way, it would be wrong to compare them to addictions, because someone who's obsessed with, collecting Hot Wheels cars is not the same thing as someone who has a heroin addiction. Okay, it's there. Yes, it's easy to kind of classify them, in a very simplistic way as being similar, but they really aren't. And so, addictions are one thing. Interests are another thing. Interests come and go. Sometimes we age into them, we age out of them. Sometimes we don't even know what they really are, or might not even be aware of them until something literally falls into your lap and you go, oh, this is interesting, right? So I think it's really dangerous to start classifying anybody who has an attraction of some sort as the same way we would as an addiction, because people, the things you liked as a teenager are not the things you like now. And there's a lot of, especially when it comes to sexual things, there's a lot of experimentation that goes on. Unfortunately, we live in a world where even that experimentation can land you in prison. You don't have to look at an illegal image 1,000 times to go to prison. You only have to look at it once and you can end up in prison, right? You might not even have liked it, but you did it, and now there's an electronic record of it having. It's like having smoked a cigarette once, deciding that you didn't like it, and still going to prison for it, right? So, in that regard, I think we have to be very careful about categorizing anybody who does something deviant as being mentally ill or addicted in some way. That being said, there's a lot of things that can be done in the mental health field to help people work their way through these things, to say, well, maybe you're just experimenting, or maybe there are healthy ways to deal with this, or maybe you can entertain this interest without harming somebody. There are lots of different things that people can do to work through these kinds of issues. And I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but obviously they have ways to deal with these things. The problem is we've developed a system where we punish people for coming forward and saying, "Hey, I think I might have a problem." If you were in high school and you went to a counselor and said, "I'm strangely attracted to those kids across the street in the elementary school," do you really think you would get help, or do you think you would have your life and the lives of your family forever changed by that? And I don't think that's in question at all. So we set up a system that punishes people for working through these things in healthy ways, and maybe, finding ways to not let it destroy your life. Um, we've We've set up laws so that counselors and psychiatrists and psychologists are required to report you if you confess to them something. I don't think it's quite that way with priests yet, but I wouldn't put it past some legislator to suggest it. So, yeah, we've come to believe that incarceration, putting people in cages or killing them, is the only way to deal with people who do something wrong, instead of giving them the tools to fix their lives and to fix themselves. And other countries do a pretty good job of it. I mean, obviously, putting people in cages is still pretty popular all over the world, but there are countries that at least have tried to make their cages more humane, limit the time you spend in the cage, give you the tools to be successful once you get out of the cage. So there are things that we can do on in that regard. As for NARSOL,
Wait,
what we really
because I think
go ahead.
I think it's a great way to end. So I want to jump in real quick with something I forgot to ask you,
Okay.
and then we'll close out with like what we're gonna do to try and
Sure.
because for what it's worth, like all of this is hard convincing anybody, and this is going to lead to the question, convincing anyone who's been taught since birth that cops in cages are the answer, that is wrong, is very difficult. And it seems especially difficult in cases of so-called sexual deviance. Sure. And so my last question is, what do we say when people say you don't care about the victims? I believe that the only way to show you care about the victims is to put that person away. How do we show we care about the victims and honestly care more about the victims by doing something else?
Well, that's a two-part answer. The first one is that the majority, and this has been studied at some length, the majority of the victims don't want the perpetrators to go into a cage and to be forgotten forever. So if we really cared about the victims, we would care about what the victim wants. Most of the time, the victim wants some kind of closure, some type of change in that person's behavior, what they really want. And you can ask victim after victim, what most of them want is to be sure that that person never commits this kind of a crime against another person again. Now, if that means sending him to treatment, getting him a job, making sure that he isn't sleeping in a box in some alley someplace, then that's what it means, right? Most of them do not want to just send somebody away, never to be seen again. That's not what victims want. And I will finish that thought off with something out of my own personal experience. And I don't talk about my case often, mainly because it's painful for me to do it, but also because it can be a real distraction from the important issues. But I will, in this case, just a little bit. My victim was a 17-year-old girl. My crime was a non-contact crime. The age of consent in my state is 16. My victim was incarcerated for 7 months as a material witness. She did not think I had done anything wrong. She did not want me to be charged with anything. She did not want to testify against me. So they jailed her for 7 months as a material witness at 17. And the only reason they let her go when they did was she turned 18.
That is the craziest thing I've ever heard.
Yeah. So tell me again about how we only want to do what the victims want, right? That's not true. Yeah, prosecutors in the system want to do what the victim wants when it agrees with what the prosecution wants. When the victim does not agree with what the prosecution wants, the victim becomes the enemy as well. And that happens in case after case after case. So again, there's no way that we're going to wave a magic wand and fix all of this. I mean, this is so rotten. It's rotten to the core at every level of the injustice system. And NARSOL wants no registries, period. No registries, not for sex offenders, not for domestic violence offenders, not for white-collar crime, drug offenses, abusing your dog, whatever it is. No registries. Shaming and humiliation has been proven not to work. We want a system that doesn't punish your family and your employer right along with you. We're not saying that you shouldn't be punished if you commit a crime. What we're saying is, how about we not punish the spouses and the children of those people by putting their address up on the internet and saying a deviant lives here, giving free reign to people who want to throw a Molotov cocktail through your window. You know what? I've had rocks thrown through my window. I've had shots taken at my house. There are bullet holes in my mailbox right now. All right? And my wife is scared to death because I'm on this list. Yeah, I'm not going to say I'm fine with being on the list or that I'm fine with being shot at. I spent 20 years in the Army. I know a little bit about being shot at, but my wife didn't do anything to deserve any of that, And we live in a system that punishes her for something that I did. And that's just not right. So NARSOL believes that the registry should be abolished entirely, that no registries should exist, and we will fight it in every venue that we can. And of course, we'll accept milestones along the way to our eventual goal, which is no registries. We would prefer it to be abolished entirely, but we'll take those small victories en route to the ultimate goal, like being fairer, being less exploitative, being rational in some way, having some rational reason. I mean, people show up, these law enforcement agencies sometimes do these sweeps where they verify everybody's address on the list, and they will literally show up in SWAT jackets, several police cars, sometimes 20 officers to verify your address. Now, imagine you've got a family. What does your 7-year-old kid think about the SWAT team, 20 officers, 6 cars, pulling up on your driveway to verify your address, when they could have done it with a postcard? So, yeah, we oppose those things. We oppose the shaming and humiliation. We oppose the politicians who pander to the public using fear and hysteria and mythology. I mean, the big myth is that, once sex offenders have this high recidivism rate, that 80% of them will go on and commit another crime. That's bullcrap. There isn't even a source for that. The people have been quoting that kind of a statistic for over 20 years, and it's a totally made up statistic. In fact, aside from homicide, sex crimes has the lowest recidivism rate, as you mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, of any crime. You are safer having someone on the registry living next door to you than almost any other category of previous crime. And after a few years, after about 7 years, the risk from that person is no different than the risk from any average person on the street. Nobody is today the same person they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. You aren't, I am not. And that pretty much holds true for most of the people on the registry. Now, are there dangerous people on the registry? Yeah. There are dangerous people off the registry too. There are dangerous people in the phone book, for crying out loud.
There are dangerous people running our corporations and our government and our police departments. So right.
Yeah, it's a red herring when people throw that into the conversation. Well, there are dangerous people there. Well, yeah, there's probably dangerous people at the place where you work. It doesn't mean you burn the place down, okay? We have to leave some of our emotions out of it and look at the facts. But that's not the way human beings, operate. We operate on emotions. Even when we think we're being rational, there's a saying that says that humans are not rational creatures. We are rationalizing creatures. We feel something and then we rationalize it and we think we have logical reasons for it, but really all we're doing is seeking out the facts that validate our existing biases, and our emotions. So,
which makes the work that you and I both do very difficult. It's not something we're going to stop doing, but unlearning a bunch of disinformation, decades worth, generations worth, it takes work. You have to be willing to do that. And I don't know about you, but I'm glad to see progress. I'm seeing it from the abolitionist perspective, more and more people are understanding it every day.
I think so. I think so. I wish we could say that it's just a matter of educating the public, but it really isn't, because
Yeah.
facts will never change anyone's mind. They have to feel it, they have to see it, and they have to live it. And when they see the people in their neighborhoods being dragged off with Gestapo tactics, when they see people being shot in the streets, when they see the inhumane conditions in our prisons and jails, and maybe they have to experience it. I don't know. I wouldn't wish that on anyone, but
That's exactly why the videos of police brutality, as painful as they are important. That's why, as distracting as it may feel to you, or as, I don't know, whatever. I know you said it was distracting, so we'll keep with
sure.
that. Your story is important. Like, which is another reason why I try to talk to as many formerly incarcerated people as I can. Like hearing a story about the ingenuity of people in prisons and jails. All the people who think they're lazy or stupid or mentally ill, they can do things that you can't. I promise you.
Right.
So yeah, it is. But of course, all of this education, all of this emotional connection doesn't mean anything if we can't push the needle, whether it's through electoralism or revolution. Right now, I do know that a lot of communities are doing what you said, law enforcement used to do. They're focusing on themselves. We protect us, building mutual aid, building community networks to keep the cops out and to protect their own. I worry, though, that people in a position like you may not get included.
You're right. We refer to that as carve outs. We get carved out of a lot of the judicial reform initiatives that are put forward. So, for example, the First Step Act, the Second Chance Act, the these pending legislation that allows for having your records purged after so many years. Many of these judicial reforms have a tough time being enacted by the legislative bodies. And one of the compromises that the reformers end up having to make over and over again is they say, okay, we'll leave the sexual offenses out of that. So, for example, we'll get Pell Grants back into the prisons, except for sex offenders. Okay, we will allow these reentry programs to be funded, except for sex offenders. And so, over and over again, we get carved out of the very things that could prevent future sexual offenses, because you wouldn't allow that person to get educated, you wouldn't allow them to get a place to live, you won't allow them to get a fresh start, and then you wonder why the guy is living in a cardboard box behind your house, right? So it's unfortunate that we do exactly the wrong thing again and again and again, because because we're operating on emotion, and two, because our laws are enacted by people who pander to the majority, and the majority of people out there have this visceral hatred of people not like them.
Yeah, and for many, it's a visceral, or it's a self-hatred.
Right.
People hate people that are like themselves if they're embarrassed about who they are. So there's that element to it too.
Sure.
We could go on forever. This has been an
Right.
awesome conversation. I really appreciate your time. I think, if I had any advice for NARSOL, it would be to be careful about making too many concessions. Reforms can be good if they chip away at the system. If it's reformism, it's only strengthening that system. So we need to be very careful. And for listeners, I highly urge you to give some real thought to what we've discussed. Relate this to your feelings about justice in general, and how we treat crime and punishment in this country. And as Michael talked about, the carve outs for people who fall under this particular category, how fair is that? Go through the NARSOL website and do what you can to support, because we are all human beings. We all make mistakes. We all have urges. And most importantly to me is, if you look at the stats, again, it is not really about protecting people. It is not about public safety. It is just another mechanism for disappearing the same people we're always trying to disappear.
Right.
Anything to add before we head out?
No, I would just add that please check out our website. It's narsol.org, and be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. Our emotions are not always our best friend. It's okay to hate somebody, but when you destroy their lives and take away any opportunity for them to become a better person, that's just not right.
Yeah, and it's self-defeating too.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Anytime.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Yep.